Well, joining us now, Nicholas Dungan, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. Thank you for being with us here on France 24.
Delighted to be here.
We're obviously hearing two messages that are quite different, it seems, between Washington and Europe at this particular point in time, ahead of those Wednesday talks in Minsk. What do you think are the prospects for those talks?
Well, I think, first of all, we need to look at the background, which is that, there was a film a few years ago by Lars von Trier called Melancholia. And I think if you did a film about this whole Ukraine situation, you could call it Schizophrenia, because there are two sides to every question. There's, first of all, Ukraine itself is partly European, partly Russian. Russia is partly European and partly its own continental country. The same is true of the United States. Even within Europe, you have a split between Germany, which is very dependent on Russian gas, France, which is not, and yet that split has not taken place or occurred or shown up. So I think the prospects depend very heavily on how much we can reconcile the differences within the West before we have to reconcile the differences between the West and Russia. And Putin has come out and said that this was all the fault of the West. I think he said that to the Egyptian president today, or the Egyptian prime minister. And he probably believes that. And he probably believes that he's a Russian patriot. I think we also need to take account of the geography here, realizing that Ukraine is the largest country in Europe. The second largest is France. And it's shaped basically like a rugby ball or an American football. And the right hand and the point, which is east, at the east end, is where all this is occurring. And that is actually just south of Moscow. It's the dew line south of Moscow. And that area of Donetsk and Luhansk is actually east of Crimea. We fail to realize Crimea is sort of under the middle of Ukraine.
And that's part of the reason some are saying there's a land grab to join up Crimea with...
Absolutely. And as far as Putin is concerned, this is like Abkhazia, or this is not just the near abroad. This is part of Mother Russia. So he feels that, and those are Russian people, to whom he's probably given Russian passports, as he did during the Georgia War. So the fact is that we're looking very much at two different perspectives on the world here, with geography being the big spoiler in the middle.
All right, so there's a siege mentality in Moscow, but what do? Germany's chancellor, she's just been saying at the White House there have been setbacks on reaching a diplomatic solution with Russia over Ukraine, but she does not see a military solution.
Well, in the U.S., John McCain, who spoke, in favor of hard power at the Munich Security Conference this weekend, is not going to have to live with the consequences if Putin decides to turn off the gas or turn up the heat or turn down the heat. So the issue is that you really need for the Americans to take account of the European point of view, and that means mostly the German point of view. And I think that when Angela Merkel spoke at the Munich Security Conference about the fact that she had to live with the existence of the Berlin Wall, that is almost interpretable as a call to sort of split Ukraine, or to split off this eastern piece of Ukraine, and perhaps keep it formally part of Ukraine, but let it be virtually self-governing in order to protect it from being completely taken over by Russia. So I think that the U.S. position, which is a very Cold War position, or at least looks like it, very driven by Munich. I think one thing we also need to understand is that from a historical point of view, the American point of view is we got into the big war in Europe, which was the Second World War, because of giving up to a dictator at Munich. Right?
In 1938.
In 1938. There's a very strong tendency still within Europe to refer, perhaps not explicitly, but back to the concept of the First World War, when essentially European civilization tore itself apart. That is part of the difference of a point of view and it isn't just the Cold War, it isn't the Second World War, it's a difference in the point of view between the Americans, who feel they won the Cold War, and the Europeans, who don't want a conflict on European soil.
So are hawkish Americans right when they say that Merkel's raising the white flag of surrender?
They might be not completely incorrect in the sense that she would prefer a peaceful solution even if it takes time and even if people have to live with the consequences under more Russian tutelage. But you mentioned that I'm at the Atlantic Council. The president of the Atlantic Council wrote a book called Berlin 1961, in which he takes John Kennedy to task for losing East Berlin. But the reality is that Kennedy was much happier to, quote, lose East Berlin to the Soviets than to have a nuclear Armageddon. And I think Merkel is taking very much a similar attitude. And I believe that at the end of the day, however much Washington wants to rattle the saber, that may be a good cop, bad cop thing, but here we're looking at a genuine difference of opinion between European leaders and U.S. leaders. And the European leaders have this problem not necessarily on their doorstep, but pretty close.
Merkel saying the peaceful order of Europe is at stake.
She is definitely believes that.
And is this going to have consequences in the relationship between the U.S. and Western Europe?
It could, and I have emphasized many times that when we have all of this feel-good talk about our common values, right, in the West, where we come a cropper, and this is what happened in the Iraq War, is when we are confronted by the values that we don't share. And the Jacksonian values, you're either with the terrorists or you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. This whole shoot 'em up, cowboy, let's go get them because that's the way we win things is by destroying the other guy. That doesn't work in the European construct. And so we need to be conscious of the genuine cultural and historical values that are different between Europe and the United States. And I think solidarity is called for. And to be quite honest, in this particular case, the United States and the U.S. leaders are going to have to give a lot of leeway to Europe. And in reality, they don't really have much choice because there's no way that the Department of Defense in the United States can go and start arming the so-called Ukrainian freedom fighters or even Ukrainian government soldiers without having all of the European allies on board.
And again, there are two schools of thoughts when it comes to Vladimir Putin. Those that say that the only thing he understands is muscle flexing, and the others who say, yes, you can dispel this siege mentality and win him over.
Well, he didn't have the siege mentality in the first place, did he? I mean, when he after the terrorist attacks in New York and so forth, when George Bush looked him deep into the eyes, there was a school of thought, and I think this is coming to the fore again, particularly in German foreign policy circles and including in German government diplomatic circles after the fall of the Berlin Wall, so we're now talking 25 years ago, right, that we must not isolate or encircle Russia. And the reason was they didn't because you had a weak leader in the form of Yeltsin, but they did not want to push so hard that there would be a repeat of what happened to Germany after the chaos of the Weimar Republic and the advent of National Socialism and the dictatorship of Hitler and everything that ensued. So they didn't want to provoke a set of circumstances that could allow a strongman to take over. And in a sense, any comparison between Putin and Hitler is, at least at this juncture, very unjustified. But he is a strong man. He's a KGB operative, and he believes himself to be a patriotic Russian. We have a different point of view from sitting where we sit, but sitting where he sits, that's pretty justified as far as he's concerned. And consequently, I think we need to take into account this genuinely how he feels. So it isn't just force. He thinks we have to also appeal to the better side of his nature, perhaps.
Final point on this, French and German diplomats saying one of the things they're putting on the table quietly is this concept of closer ties between the European Union and what he wants, this Eurasian Union. Is that just a sideshow for him, or is that important?
Well, no, I don't think it is, because I think what people have begun to realize, and maybe John McCain hasn't begun to realize this, but I suspect Barack Obama has, is that we don't want this man feeling isolated and angry. So what can we do to tie him in, to bind him in, to bring him in, to make him feel that he's part of the European family? And there's always been, particularly in Paris, perhaps less so in Berlin, but there's always been this feeling that if you treat the Russians like Europeans, they'll act like Europeans. It's not that simple. But the reality is there's some truth to it.
All right. Singing it certainly from the same hymn sheet at the White House, Angela Merkel saying, if success is not possible for diplomacy with Russia, Europe and the United States will have to explore other options. Nicholas Dungan, I want to thank you for joining us here today.
Thank you.
Cat.